Welcome to the Protagonist Pub. My name is Tammy, and this afternoon we are going to talk about all I read in the second half of June.
To the oceans, white with foam.
We finished June on the Range book. We read for Red, White, and June, Big Book Summer, Mystery, and I'm going to shock you all. I read a biography. So, no DNFs in the last half either. Okay, let's dive in. Let's do June on the Range first. And there are technically two books for this. And that would be Texas by, first up would be Texas by James Michener. It is a big honkin' 1,400 plus page. And I read about 600 pages of this to finish it off in June. Like all Michener books, it's fantastic. It tells the story of Texas through fictional characters with the occasional appearance of actual characters. And this covers 1535 to 1984. And that much. And it is fascinating. It covers the Spanish northerly migration into Texas from Mexico, American expansion into Mexico, Indians and cowboys and ranches and discovery of oil and the Depression and the rise of Houston as a powerhouse. All of the things are in here that you think of quintessentially Texan in a very readable format. There are 14, in essence, novellas that make up the book. And each one, the book opens with the Governor's Task Force and closes with the Governor's Task Force. And yeah, I was right, 14. The Governor's Task Force is the mechanism used to tie all the novellas together. And the purpose of said task force is to work on what should be the new Texas history curriculum courses for Texas middle grade and high school students. And there is a nice variety on the task force. They bring specialists in to discuss the history as it's presented in the novella, preceding it, and it ends with the task force tying it all up. And it's fascinating. It's well done. Each novella is roughly 100 pages each, so it could easily, be read in snippets over the course of a couple of months if you just read a chapter a week. It's very approachable that way. It's very engaging. And right in the front of the book, it tells you per chapter who is a fictional character and who is a real person. Very important. And I highly recommend, if you're going to read a Michener book, bookmarking the fact and fiction pages and then the maps in the front of the book so that you can pinpoint the fictional towns in relationship to, let's say, known landmarks that really exist, like Dallas or Austin or Houston. Highly recommend. Highly, highly recommend. You don't have to be Texan to read this. It certainly doesn't hurt, But you don't have to be Texan to read this and fall in love with it. Okay. Next up would be Death Where the Bad Rocks Live by C.M. Wendelboe. This is the second book in the... Can never remember the name of this series. I know where I bought the first one. I bought the first one at the Crazy Horse Memorial Monument in South Dakota. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. And they do not have the name of the series in here. I'll put it down below. This is a police procedural with an FBI agent and the reservation police. It takes place in the Badlands of South Dakota. I love the setting in this book so very much. They're all mysteries, obviously, being a police procedural. You could read them out of order, but the character progression would obviously be a little... Hello, gardener. Can I help you? You're scaring the puppy. Oh, Lord. Hubby makes an appearance. So, in the Badlands, on the reservation, they discover an old car where the U.S. military did bombing runs in the World War II, and they discover 3 dead bodies inside, and it's assumed that they're all, from the 40s. Turns out that's not true. They solve the mystery. It's tight, it's twisty, it's well done. You get South Dakota just comes screaming through that book. And I have book 3 on my shelves. And I'm going to save it for when I, need a good South Dakota mood. So, highly, highly recommend the series. Next up are 3 revolutionary books. And I'm not sure the order to talk about them. So we're going to talk about the Abigail Adams Cozy Mystery first. That is Sup with the Devil by Barbara Hamilton. This is the 3rd and final book in the trilogy. I'm very sad it's done. This is Abigail solving a mystery while John is once again out of town, but this time it is her nephew that needs his aunt's help. The colony is awaiting the repercussions of the Boston Tea Party, and every day Abigail is very fearful that John is going to be on the list of traitors and everybody's going to be, hung. Sam Adams is John's cousin, and Sam is definitely going to be on the list. Is John going to be on the list? Is just a constant underlying theme. And you really feel for Abigail in this book. And she solves this very, with the help of, the Sons of Liberty, her sickly nephew who's at Harvard, his friends, solve the murder of one of his classmates. And Abigail is very much Abigail in this book. If you know, you know. But even though this is fiction and nothing like this actually happened in our life, you can still very clearly see Abigail Adams. And that's why I love this series so much. Now that I finished it, the question becomes, am I going to donate them? And the answer most likely is no, which tells you something about how much I love this book. So, and that leads me to the biography. Dearest Friend by Lynn Withy. Uh, this is a narrative. There's nothing academic in this book. Well, okay. It's very academic, but it doesn't read like an academic biography like the last one I read for Abigail. And this had a lot to do with why I'm suddenly interested in biographies. I read this in a couple of days, not because I was trying to rush through it to finish it by the end of June. It's just incredibly readable and personable, and the challenges she faced with John being gone so long and the colony being in uproar and then independence and John's gone again and she's raising 4 children. She's buried 2. She risks inoculating herself and the kids when against smallpox when John is out of the country and she can't talk to him about it. She does it anyway. Knowing the risk of death is not insignificant, but the benefits are great. And besides their great love story, which I'll talk about in a minute, the thing that comes through this book repeatedly is just how lucky we are. And we take it for granted because it is a normal experience for us. That our communication is instantaneous. If you need your husband to pick up milk on his way home, you send him a text or you call him. If you, in the middle of the day, need to check on aging parents, same thing. We were waiting weeks and months. We don't have to wait weeks and months for letters to go from point A to point B if they made it at all. We just are blessed with the ability to instantly talk to those we love. And it has made conversation and communication a little cheap because we don't value it as highly because it's so instantaneous and we take it for granted and we don't get that same visceral reaction of getting a letter in the mail or the same instantaneous relief of, oh, he made it across the ocean. We don't send our kids on vacation, be it for school or, graduation trips or whatever, and not hear from them on months on end, or they're not gone for years on end with very little communication. And yet, not too long ago, that was the norm. And this really drives it home without that being a point of constant contention. And I've been a little lax on communication. And if you're one of the people I've been lax with, I apologize and I will be better. Okay. So, John and Abigail is a love story. At its heart, these are 2 people. Okay, where was I? Yeah. John and Abigail is truly a love story. They were married for more than 50 years. They had 6 children together, 4 living. Okay. John and Abigail truly love story. They had 6 children together, 4 of which survived until adulthood. They spent more than 10 years apart because John was in service of his nation. He went to France for years on end. He was the first ambassador to England. He negotiated the peace treaty. He negotiated the economic agreement. He was then Secretary of State under Washington, and then he became president. Now, admittedly, while he was Secretary of State and president, he was home. But even when he was home, they spent significant time apart because, you know, you can only go so far by horse and carriage or horse per day before you have to stop and rest. And it took a week to go from Boston to Philadelphia, um, and then back again to response. This was luckily a marriage between people who loved each other, because if not, that extended time apart would have been problematic. And I'm not saying it was always smooth sailing between John and Abigail. It wasn't. Every once in a while, she would, worry about the French women. Was John being enticed? They'd been apart so long. She was roughly 10 years younger than him. And she was, just like a normal woman, had her doubts. But the one thing neither John nor Abigail ever doubted was that independence was necessary, and they were united. And Abigail's influence on John cannot be underestimated. However, her quote unquote proto feminism is always overestimated. In no sense of the word was Abigail Adams a feminist. She believed a woman's place was at her in the home, being her husband's helpmate, raising the kids, doing the domestic side. But that does not mean, and Abigail herself says this, that women shouldn't be educated. She was extremely well read. She had no formal education because she was a very sickly child. She was always embarrassed of her spelling and her grammatical mistakes, and she begged people to burn her letters so that, posterity wouldn't remember her as an uneducated woman. And thankfully, all of, we have so many surviving letters and journals from Abigail and John. And she helped him. She helped him reason stuff out. The oft quoted, remember the ladies. She tells John that, women and young girls should be as educated as their male counterparts, and there is no reason that should not happen in a free society. It is a beautiful book. It is, she exchanges letters with Thomas Jefferson, representatives to the Continental Congress, signers of the Declaration of Independence, famous women of her day, including Mercy Otis Warren and Catherine McCullough. She travels to France and England, which was, took months to go one way, especially if, the ship gets becalmed at sea or they have to put it into a foreign port because of weather. All the things. You just learn what our ancestors were willing to do to give us what we take for granted today and think were entitled to without question. And it truly makes you appreciate everything they were willing to do because it was the right thing. So I highly, highly recommend this book. If you have read or are reading A Founding Mother and you want a go-to source for Abigail's life, this is under 350 pages. In fact, it's like 315 pages for the text. Text is 317 pages. It is incredibly readable, and it's another one that's staying on my shelf. Okay, that brings us to the last, although not chronologically, last book I read in the month of June, and that is Valley Forge by Newt Gingrich and William Force Chen. This is the second book in the Revolutionary War series, and as you might imagine, takes place in Valley Forge and the surrounding areas in the winter of 1777 and 1778. And much like the selflessness and the sacrifice I was talking about in the Abigail biography, that is all very present here on the rebel side, on the American side. And in contrast, you see the loyalist side as they spend the winter of 1777, 1778 in Philadelphia, having parties and balls, and they're well fed and they're warm and they have clothes and all the things our guys didn't have. And yet our guys, a lot of them stayed and put up with it, and the lice and the ticks and the no shoes in the bitter winter of 1777 and 1778. And you see the fecklessness of the Continental Congress, and you begin to see some fractures around the concept of a standing army in a free United States. Washington was on one end of that discussion, and the Adams were on the other end, and everything in between. And there are many a historical figure in this book: John Andre, Peggy Shippen, Benedict Arnold he makes a brief appearance, possibly. Gates is in here, Benjamin Rush, Cornwallis, all these people that you vaguely remember from your civics class way back in the day, American history class, are in here, but they're brought to life. And they're not the focus of the story. The focus of the story is the men in the field and the loyalist brother who's conflicted in Philadelphia. And just, there's some spying going on. And eventually there's the battle that turns the tide of victory. And you see how they go from desperation in December of 1777 to the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey in June of 1778, a completely transformed military force. We go from rebels to a trained military force because of one man. And, if it wasn't for him and the influence of Baron von Steuben, the chances of us winning the Revolutionary War had greatly diminished. But he turns the army around, and he changes this nation, fledglingly as we were at that point. Which brings me to the last point of Valley Forge and the Revolutionary War, at least for this video. And that is the cost of life is an ever present worry in the Valley Forge. You know, sending men into battle, being unable to clothe his army, you know, walking through the hastily constructed wind that keeps pouring through hospital Washington and his men construct in Valley Forge. Soldiers regularly having their feet amputated, their hands because of frostbite, and the cost of sending men into battle that aren't trained for it against what at the time was the world's greatest standing army and the world's greatest nation, the Empire of the British. And you see the cost of human life and being willing to sacrifice it. And as we have grown technologically, it is much easier to engage in battle because a lot of it these days is done by drones. It becomes a video game. There's no looking another man in the eye across the battlefield and knowing that he's going to kill you or you're going to kill him, and both of you need to make that choice. It kind of drives home the point, and it makes you reflect on how brave our ancestors were and how deeply they felt the cost. And I think we don't feel the cost anymore because it's on a screen, not actually experienced. And that's a problem. It's not true universally. We still have troops on the ground. I understand all that, but we are getting further and further away from always having troops on the ground. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to sacrifice lives. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's hard to remember the cost of your actions when your actions are removed from the actual result. Okay, and on that unintentionally heavy and philosophical thought, that was everything I read in June. June was an absolutely fabulous reading month, and I'm so glad I read everything I did. How was your June month? Let me know in the comments down below. Like and subscribe, and I will see you here next time at the Protagonist Pub.